Was I a good TV streaming box?
No. You were the best.
But seriously, where's the HDMI cable? Oh, you gotta buy that separately. You just... Basically, as long as I've been making tech videos, I've been using Apple TVs. Yes, my family originally bought that third generation thin TV box that honestly looks like it's from the future now because of how thick all of these little black boxes have gotten. But when they first refreshed it with tvOS and everything and the trackpad, that was actually the first Apple product I bought certified refurbished because I've always had an issue with the price. Ever since they started putting Apple Silicon in these things, I felt like $150 and then later $180, $200 for just a little box that streams TV channels is still way too much, especially considering they still don't include the HDMI cable. But you know, I used it. I always appreciated the fluidity of tvOS, and I got pretty comfortable with the old-fashioned trackpad and scrolling and everything. But I can admit that most people in my personal life still never quite got the hang of that finicky remote, and they definitely over-engineered it way too much for gaming, and they fixed a lot of my concerns with it with the next generation Siri remote, which went back to what me and my parents both loved about our original third generation Apple TV, was just that silver, simple, sleek remote. It didn't have as many buttons as we have now, but that's honestly a good thing because we use our remote for dictation and power and volume now, whereas before, the Apple TV was looked at as like this secondary device you hooked up to your TV, so it provided one remote, but you had to grab a different one for volume and everything. But I still always loved that silver aluminum style of remote. It was much easier to see in the dark. It stood out against an ocean of black plastic that we're used to with most remotes these days. And the fact that they've brought back that design, but also made it thicker and more chunk, and more recently, thankfully, switched it to USB-C, makes me so incredibly happy with the current state of the Siri remote. But still, the software and the clunkiness of that OG $80 glass Siri remote kind of pushed me away from using the Apple TV, right? Because I had bought HomePods that I was very happy with, and you could technically hook up your Apple TV to HomePods back in the day, but every time you turned off the Apple TV, it would disconnect them and you'd have to go into settings and reconnect them every single time you turn the thing on. And because that old Siri remote was so limited in functionality, you know, it didn't have a mute button, it didn't have a power button either, and half of it was black, which meant that it was a lot harder to see in the dark, and it was so thin that it would slip between couch cushions and stuff. I eventually just stopped using my old Apple TV 4K that I bought way back in, I think, 2017 when they refreshed it, because I had recently picked up a new cheap TCL TV from Best Buy for like $400, and it was 4K and it had a Roku built into it. And part of the reason I'm such a hardcore Apple sheep is because I like all-in-one designs. I like things like the iMac Pro or even the MacBook Pro because it's got everything you need. Amazing speakers, great display, great keyboard, great battery life. You don't have to pack around multiple things, and that's part of the reason I opted to have so much storage in my laptop, is because I don't like carrying extra accessories. I just like devices to be all-in-one, and it frustrates me still that Apple doesn't want to design one TV that just has tvOS baked into it and just one remote to worry about, and maybe we'll get there one day, but it doesn't feel like it's gonna happen. But that's what attracted me to the Roku TV. Even though, yes, the Roku is a bit more clunky and the UI is not as clean or as simple, it did only require one remote, and while it was not the best remote in the business, it still required batteries, ew. It did let me change the volume and the power and the inputs and everything just from one single remote, which made me like it a lot more than the Apple TV I was using at the time, with all of its software quirks of having to reconnect to external speakers, and the built-in speakers on the Roku TV were honestly pretty good as well. So that's where I kind of abandoned the Apple TV. I sold it off and didn't use it much for several years until recently, where this year Apple TVs started getting very, very cheap, even the 4K ones, not just because of the refresh where Apple updated it with the A15 chip and no fan. Now you can pick those up for like $130, which is great, but still on Amazon, if you're comfortable buying last year's model, which performance-wise, I really don't think you're gonna notice a difference between the A12 and A15 chip on your Apple TV. Biggest reason probably not to do it is if you buy last year's model, the Siri remote still has lightning. That's a bit of a bummer, but you can pick up an Apple TV 4K for like $99, $20, and that's where my friend was picking up a couple and said, hey, do you want to try this one again? Because they were so cheap, I think lots of people started scooping them up. So finally I caved and just said, okay, I'm not gonna have my dream setup anymore. We were having a lot of software bugs and app crashes with our Roku as well. Plus we had to go through several remotes because the buttons got all weared out, you know, cheap plastic and stuff. So I was like, okay, let's try out the Apple TV again. We hooked it up. We still got to have the little black box beneath the TV and everything, but switching from using a Roku for like 4 years to now going back to the Apple TV 4K made me appreciate so many things that tvOS enables in my day-to-day use. So of course the UI is clean and everything runs a lot smoother now because you have a very overkill processor powering this whole thing, but thankfully via software they do now let you keep the HomePods paired with the Apple TV. You don't have to manually pair it every single time. The volume buttons just directly change the volume of the HomePod as well. That was a pet peeve of many TV setups in the past for me, is just that you have to have like, oh, this remote for this and this remote for this. Not allowed in this household. We need to have one remote that controls everything, and thanks to the new Siri remote with the power button and the mute button, we can do everything just with a single remote. The HomePod, of course, still sounds amazing, and the D-pad design is a lot more easy for everyday people to understand. You don't have to be a trackpad expert like I am. You can just click on those buttons if you don't feel like swiping back and forth, because that can be a little confusing to guests or family. I've been using it since July, and I still haven't plugged in the Siri remote, so it sucks that it still has lightning, but haven't had to charge it, so I don't really care. But the biggest advantage that I primarily wanted to talk about when switching to the Apple TV is multitasking. Apps running in the background with tvOS save so much time compared to our old Roku. I don't know if the newer 4K Roku support this or not, and I'm not gonna find out because I'm not interested, but on the old Roku, if you opened up YouTube, okay, it takes a while for the loading screen to buffer and everything, and then you choose your account and you start watching a video, but then as soon as you leave that app, it immediately shuts down. It's closed because I'm sure they're putting a very cheap ARM chip in all of these Rokus. If you open up a different application, it has to relaunch all over again, and then if you go back to YouTube, once again, that app has to completely relaunch. Whereas what I love about the Apple TV is that it keeps those apps running in the background, so as soon as you're finished watching a movie on Paramount Plus, for instance, you just double click that home button to go into multitasking, switch to YouTube, and it can literally just be exactly where you left off in a YouTube video. And even if you put everything to sleep, even if you hold the power button, TV entirely shuts off and everything, you press power button again after a couple hours have gone by, and boom, it relaunches right to exactly where you were last using your TV. This saves so much time compared to the Roku, and it's a feature that I don't think gets talked enough about with Apple TVs, is the multitasking saves a lot of time when you're switching between channels, and remembers where you're leaving off within certain applications, which is very useful because so many apps just love to close and crash in the background. So while CPU and GPU performance for gaming, I don't think most people care about with Apple TVs, RAM management, surprisingly kind of helpful, and has definitely paid off in the long run when using these things. So it's never quite perfect, but we're getting a lot closer. I would still love to have a dedicated streaming stick so that we don't have to sacrifice, you know, table or desk space for a big black box. I feel like it's 2022. Apple knows how to make small, compact, efficient designs. They could find a way to stuff the whole Apple TV on the back. And yes, even $130 does feel a little high for the Apple TV, but it's still a lot cheaper than it was, so I'm not complaining. And I also think that HDMI cables should be included with these things. There's just so few people that are buying Apple TVs that are just like, oh yeah, I can just reuse this HDMI cable that I wasn't doing anything with. But the fact that you can get them now for so cheap through Amazon, and don't shy away from buying a used model either, because this is not a device you're going to be holding or looking at a lot. You're just going to plug it in once and then kind of forget it's there. And I also thought I would appreciate the dictation button a lot more because our old Roku didn't have that, but honestly, it's still kind of confusing in my opinion, where there's certain situations where you're trying to search using dictation, and other situations where Siri pops up. It still gets a little confusing to the point that family and friends that come over don't even try to mess around much with dictation. I was trying to sign into accounts recently and trying to spell out the email and password, and it still was mishearing me a lot, so cool in concept, not so great in the real world execution for us. But I'm very glad we have it. I'm very glad the prices are going down, and it seems like the EU is going to ensure that there's never going to be an Apple TV 8K, if you will. So there might not be that many upgrades for the Apple TV in due time. Perhaps that's why Apple switched the Siri remote to USB-C, because this is going to last us for many years to come. How are you guys feeling about about newer Apple TVs. Are you happy with them? What changes would you like to see? All that good stuff. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you all in the next one.